Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a phenomenon that is literally everywhere you look, global English. I mean, how exactly did it reach this level of absolute worldwide dominance? And honestly, what does its massive footprint mean for all the other languages out there? Let's jump right in and objectively explore the history and the fascinating academic theories behind this absolute linguistic giant. Okay, let's dive into this. Is English a practical tool or an imperial weapon? That right there is the central inquiry of our entire explainer today. We're going to look closely at whether the global dominance of English is just this neutral, convenient bridge for modern communication, or if it actually functions as a sort of invisible force that maintains historical power dynamics. To really unpack all of that, here's our roadmap for today. First, the global English question. Then, a natural lingua franca, followed by defining linguistic imperialism, colonialism, and language erasure, the classroom power dynamic, and finally, linguistic human rights today. All right, starting off with Section 1, the global English question. Let's really understand the dominance of English worldwide. So as you know, the sheer scale of English is totally undeniable. I mean, it heavily dominates former British colonies, places like Kenya, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan, where it often serves as the language of the elite. But, its reach goes way, way beyond just the legacy of empire. Think about the post-Cold War era. English rapidly expanded into Eastern Europe, basically replacing Russian as the regional go-to language. And today, it operates as a massive working language in huge global institutions like the European Union. So the scale is massive, no doubt about it. But the real debate we're looking at is about what's actually driving the spread. Moving on to Section 2, a natural lingua franca, let's explore the perspective of English as a neutral tool. And this brilliantly illustrates a truly fascinating academic debate that sits right at the heart of our explainer. On one side, you have the prominent linguist David Crystal. He suggests the spread of English is organic, that it's driven by completely natural historical and economic factors. So in his view, English is just a descriptive, neutral, and highly practical global language. But on the flip side, emeritus professor Robert Phillipson completely disagrees. He argues that this spread is absolutely no accident. Instead, he views it as being driven by deliberate political and cultural agendas to serve very specific commercial and geopolitical interests. It's essentially two entirely different lenses looking at the exact same phenomenon. Which brings us to Section 3, defining linguistic imperialism, in looking at when language maintains privilege. So, we really need to look closely at this concept of linguicism. The term was coined by researcher Tove Skutnab-Kangas, and as you can see here, it's defined as the ideologies, structures, and practices used to legitimate, effectuate, regulate, and reproduce an unequal division of power and resources between groups defined on the basis of language. That is quite a mouthful, right? But what is absolutely crucial to understand here is that linguicism is argued to function structurally, much in the same way as racism or sexism. It's not just about, your individual language preferences. It's about entrenched systems, financial investments, and massive hierarchical structures that elevate one language while systematically marginalizing others. In fact, Professor Phillipson hit the nail on the head when he said, linguicism is an instrument by which those who are privileged maintain their dominance. The underlying theory posits that if you speak the dominant language natively, doors just naturally open for you. But if you don't, the language itself acts as this invisible gatekeeper, actively restricting your access to education, power, and economic resources. Let's turn to Section 4, colonialism and language erasure, where we examine the historical roots of these language policies. To really grasp this, we have to recognize that this isn't just some modern phenomenon. There's a long, heavily documented history of deliberate language suppression. Going way back to the 17th century, you have Oliver Cromwell explicitly aiming to make Ireland, quote, thoroughly English. Fast forward a bit to 1834, and Thomas Babington Macaulay is penning his infamous Minute, passionately arguing for English-only education in India. And we see this exact same pattern continue through the devastating Irish famine in the 1840s, administered by Charles Trevelyan, which drastically reduced the Gaelic-speaking population. We even see it extending all the way into the 20th century suppression of indigenous Sami languages in Northern Europe. To really understand the explicit mindset of that colonial era, just listen to the words of Charles Trevelyan in 1834. Writing directly to the Governor-General of British-occupied India, he bluntly stated that British colonizers aim to establish our language, our learning, and ultimately our religion in India. This shows that the spread of English wasn't just about facilitating trade or anything harmless like that. It was deeply, deeply intertwined with exporting a very specific worldview. But hey, we aren't just talking about ancient history here. Take a look at the Inuit in Nunavut, Canada. A 2019 report presented to the UN actually argued that inadequate minority education policies regarding the Inuktitut language constitute linguistic and cultural genocide. Let that sink in for a second. This is an active, severe, and very much ongoing human rights issue happening today. Now for Section 5, the classroom power dynamic. Here we'll be deconstructing English language teaching. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing exactly how these massive power dynamics play out in modern schools. Phillipson points directly to what he calls the 5 false foundational tenets of British English language teaching. These include things like the monolingual fallacy, which is this idea that English must be taught entirely in English, and the native speaker fallacy, which assumes that native speakers just inherently make the best teachers. He strongly argues that these assumptions are deeply flawed because they completely ignore the local linguistic context of the students in the classroom. The counter-argument to those fallacies is actually pretty simple. The ideal language educator inherently understands the native language of their learners. When institutions just import monolingual teachers from, say, the US or the UK, teachers who don't speak a single word of the student's native tongue, they're importing a pedagogy that completely ignores translation and local culture. Critics of this approach argue that it deeply alienates learners and basically builds an educational system that caters only to a very small English-speaking elite. Bringing us to our final part, Section 6, Linguistic Human Rights Today. Let's look at how we're seeking balance and cultural justice. So, if communities want to protect their mother tongue, they first have to define what that actually means. And as it turns out, it's incredibly multi-layered. Researcher Telvis Kangas breaks it down into 4 distinct areas. First, it can be defined by origin, simply the language you learned first. But it can also be defined by identification, the language you internally identify with or are externally identified as a native speaker of. Then there's competence, the language you know best. Or it can be defined just by function, the language you find yourself using the most. It really goes to show that defining linguistic rights is this incredibly dynamic, lifelong part of human identity. Fortunately, communities across the globe are actively using these nuanced definitions to fight language death. For example, in Norway, education in indigenous Sami languages is now available all the way from kindergarten through university. In New Zealand, Maori groups are utilizing legal tribunals to successfully reassert their right to use their native language in public services. And in India, researchers are really pushing for a multilingual reality, where they seamlessly integrate tribal languages, regional languages, and English all together. It's amazing to see language revitalization in action. But of course, we absolutely have to look at the future of translation. With the rapid rise of AI tools like Google Translate and ChatGPT, global communication is literally shifting overnight. I mean, these AI systems are becoming incredibly sophisticated. However, currently, they primarily serve as highly effective tools for folks who already possess high linguistic competence. Why? Because those people are the ones who can actually evaluate and refine the AI's output. Which leaves us with a massive, thought-provoking question for the future. As AI drastically alters the balance of linguistic power, will technology finally make English a truly neutral tool, a sort of perfect instant translation bridge for everyone? Or will it simply digitize linguistic imperialism, permanently encoding historical dominance into the very algorithms that run our future? It's a huge question. I really hope this explainer has given you the solid foundation you need to explore it yourself. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.